It's wonderful to be here. I've been, well, let me say first, can people way in the back hear okay? Is the sound okay? I feel a little bit awkward being way back from you guys because I'd like to be close, but I guess for the moment I thought I might go where Jess was, but we'll see how it goes. Anyway, it's wonderful to be here. It's my second visit to Seattle. I didn't come on the same airplane with John Kerry, who's was up in Everett and down in Tacoma, I guess, or was up in Tacoma this morning, I guess. But he is my senator, and we'll probably have some words to say about Mr. Kerry, since I've known him for about 25 years. But I want to sort of set the stage for a larger conversation. Since my sort of image of how most of us come to understand the world is, and particularly as filtered through the mass media, is that we see personalities. We see Mr. Kerry. We see, of course, George W. Bush. And we see people speaking for the Democratic Party or for the Republican Party and so forth. Americans are very focused on personalities and individual leaders, and though these are very important people indeed. But my idea of a regime suggests that there's something more than the personalities. I think a lot of people, for example, they sometimes say, who is Bush? You know, how did this happen to the United States? That we got a president like George W. Bush? And what's happened to the Democratic Party? Who is, you know, why do we have somebody like John Kerry, who's sort of running as an anti-Bush, but is not clearly standing for many of the principles that we sort of associate historically with democracy? How did he get to be the candidate? And my way of thinking about this is that since Kerry likes to use, you know, swift boat, maritime metaphors about his role in the Navy and so forth, a little maritime metaphor here, that the current events that most of us get exposed to represent kind of the surface of the ocean. And the faces bobbing up are personalities that you can see on the surface. But if you looked underneath the surface, you would find that their feet are anchored on a structure. And that structure is dense, and it's powerful, and it represents something that we all need to pay a great deal of attention to. And that's what I mean by the regime. So what I want to do in my comments is to give you an idea of what I mean by a regime and why I'm optimistic about the possibility of regime change here at home. I often tell this little story, which is probably apocryphal, about if you call the White House. Has anybody here called the White House recently? Okay, wow, that's quite a few hands. I've been told that if you call right into George's office, you'll get an answering machine saying, "Hi, this is W. I can't answer the phone right now, but just leave your name, your number, and the country you'd like to have me invade, and I'll get back to you." Now, that's a good definition of a regime as Americans are taught to think about it. It's a bad government somewhere else that probably the American government would like to overthrow. And so when you start thinking about regimes in America, it's an odd idea, because we're so accustomed to thinking about regimes as bad guys or bad systems of power over there. And what I've tried to do in the book is to make a serious case for the idea. It seems like a frivolous title, Regime Change Begins at Home. And in fact, I saw it in a poster on an anti-war march, and it made me laugh. But I came to think about it in a more serious way. I had a sleepless night, which is almost always a sign that there's a book germinating in my over-exercised brain. And the next morning, I was persuaded that there was an idea, an important idea, worth thinking about behind this humorous slogan of Regime Change Begins at Home. And so I want to give you an idea of this. Let me just say, like Mr. Kerry, I almost came here as a presidential candidate. Some strange studio in Hollywood saw my book and called me up and said, "We'd like you to run for president." Now this, they probably thought of that because you notice there's a White House on the cover of the book and a for sale sign, and it says sold. So they thought I had some interesting ideas about if I were running for president. And I said, what's this all about? And they said, well, we're actually running a reality show, sort of like Survivor. There were going to be 10 candidates running for president, and you want to be the last guy standing. Well, Howard Zinn and Noam Chomsky and a few other people called me up and said, you ought to do this. It's a good way of getting your thoughts across. And I said back to them, you ought to do this. I thought they'd probably be better at it than I would. Then I read the fine print, and I discovered that the large corporation that ran the Hollywood studio, that ran this reality show, would pretty much own me lock, stock, and barrel. Own my trips to the bathroom, own all my medical records, own everything about me, my wife, my students, you guys for coming and listening to me. And I was thinking, here I've just written a book about how corporations own the whole country, everybody here in this room, lock, stock, and barrel. And me, I don't want to be owned lock, stock, and barrel twice by this corporation. So I turned down their kind offer and decided to make my own little tour around the country, not as a presidential candidate, but as a commentator on what's happening in the country right now. So here I am. By the way, I've been traveling a lot. I've never traveled so much. I was in Europe last fall in relation to a book on globalization I had written, and the Europeans kept saying to me, how come we can't vote in your elections? I mean, if you elect Bush, that has an effect on our lives more than, whether Schroeder is elected or whether Chirac is elected again. So it's a recognition of how much the rest of the world is interested in and paying attention. When I first went to your friend Arnold Schwarzenegger had just been elected governor of California, and when I went to speak in a little town outside of Rome, Italy, there was the cinema marquee showed Terminator 3 playing in 3 different theaters at the time, and so all they wanted to talk about was Mr. Schwarzenegger and what in the world has happened to people in California. I talked about this in California. I know you're not California, but you're sort of close enough that it might hurt a little bit to know that people in Italy are thinking about America in terms of Mr. Bush and Mr. Schwarzenegger. So let me give a little bit of the bad news here before I get into the hopeful message that I hope I can leave you with. And the bad news is pretty grim, and it's about the nature of this regime. What I try to do in the book is make an argument that American history can be reread as a succession of regimes and regime changes. Obviously, the first regime change in the United States was the Revolution. And that was a very significant regime change. But I really fast forward the analysis of the book into after the Civil War. The Civil War was an important war for a lot of reasons and a lot of misunderstood reasons. I think it was a war largely fought not to liberate the slaves, which it didn't do very successfully, but it did liberate the modern corporation, and it liberated the South for modern capitalism. And that war gave rise to some war profiteering that gave rise to some very wealthy individuals who created the first modern corporations. And these were the robber barons, people like Jay Gould and Rockefeller and others. And it's interesting that the roots of the modern corporation have their feet, I'm mixing metaphors here, their origins in war. And of course, even back to the British Empire, corporations, the East Indies Company, the Massachusetts Bay Company, was about colonialization and conquest. So it's interesting to note that the corporate system has always had a relationship to war, and it's a very frightening relationship today for reasons that I'll talk about. It's a new kind of relationship. But after the Civil War, America for the first time became a corporate possession. From about 1865 to 1901, when Teddy Roosevelt came in after the assassination of McKinley, the country was run by the first large national companies that ever existed in the United States. There had been corporations before, but Jefferson and Madison, I have a lot of quotes in this book which are really striking to read from presidents. Because presidents all along have talked about the potential danger of large accumulations of capital and corporations, to be specific, the particular legal form that we call corporations, to the American experiment. Jefferson and Madison, I mean, it's not so hard to believe, I suppose, about Jefferson, but Madison wrote that corporations, the growth of modern corporations, might destroy democracy in America. Abraham Lincoln in 1864, when the Civil War was being fought, wrote much the same thing. And I've got a litany of these quotes just because I think it's so striking how many different kinds of presidents have alerted us to the potential dangers of a corporate-driven America. The Gilded Age of the robber barons in the late 19th century is a fabulous window into understanding our current times. And I'm not the first to say this, but I've written about this before, and I write about it in the book here. And I strongly urge people to think back to that period, because it's the closest period for understanding what's happening to our communities and to our lives and our spirits today. And of course, as you know, it was a period of ruthless industrial development. Labor, the kind of people that Jess was talking about, the hands who were building America, were being abused in ways that are very parallel to what's happening to the modern global labor force under the current regime. And we had a development in that period, that what I call the first corporate regime, which lasted from 1865 at the end of the Civil War to the election of Teddy Roosevelt in the ushering in of the progressive regime. I know many of you are interested in this in Seattle and across the country in this issue of corporate personhood and the issue of corporate rights and how they relate to our own constitutional rights. And this whole issue has roots historically in the constitutional decision-making of that regime. As you know, in 1886, the Supreme Court, which is always the architect of regimes in some sense, the Supreme Court is very important today. We really have had probably 4 or 5 constitutions rather than a single constitution. This case has been made by a Yale law professor named Bruce Ackerman in a trilogy of powerful books about the Constitution. And each of the regimes I talk about has made dramatic changes in the way the Constitution is written. And the one that I think interests a lot of people here, because I know there are a lot of activists on these issues, and rightfully so, it's a very fundamental issue, has to do with what seems to be a very abstract idea that in 1886, a clerk in the Supreme Court, in a case called the Santa Clara decision, made the interpretation that the court for the first time had defined the corporation as a person, legal fictive person, protected under the Bill of Rights. And that, of course, gave the corporation for the first time a constitutional umbrella of protections that allowed it to have privacy from, for example, environmental inspection, First Amendment rights for speech and giving money to candidates, 14th Amendment rights to not be excluded from or treated differently than other kinds of organizations, and so forth. This vesting of rights in the corporation was one of the most insidious contributions of this first corporate regime, and I'll return to it. I'm putting a little attention on it only because it's important in thinking about what we can do to free America from corporate rule. And that has to do partly with reversing this cumulative trend toward vesting corporations with the power of constitutional rights. Let me fast forward to the second corporate regime, a second period in which corporations dominated America, and that was the Roaring Twenties, a period very much like our current era as well. Big business dominated the country, dominated Washington, dominated the 3 Republican presidents. All the Republican presidents, Hoover, Coolidge, Harding, had their feet anchored in that corporate regime. It was a different corporate regime than the one today, but it was basically focused on winning the hearts and minds and the wallets of Americans rather than the world as a whole. And it introduced the religion of corporate regimes, which is mass consumerism. And every regime is partly a process of constructing faith in itself, and it does that by building a system of thought, a web of ideas, which controls much of the way we think and live. That regime, after some spectacular financial crises like the Enron and Tyco scandals of today, Teapot Dome scandal and so forth, had an irrationally exuberant run-up in the markets, about like in the 90s, and it crashed. And that crash, through a series of events, led to a regime change with Franklin Roosevelt coming into power in 1932. Roosevelt came in as a Hooverist, and I say this, it's important that when Roosevelt came in, he was not a regime changer. He was a rich guy, very much shaped by the ideology of the second corporate regime of the 20s. So when the corporations had made a mess of the country in the Great Depression, Roosevelt had inherited that regime's ideas that whatever corporations do that ruin the country, they are the only entity that can save it. And it took mass protests by ordinary people in workplaces and on the streets to wean Roosevelt's mind away from the thinking of that regime. I mention this because it points to something very important. One is, it's what you and I do that ultimately shapes when a regime changes. It's not what the elites come into power intending to do. And I say it also because regimes are systems of thought control in the end. They're ways of silencing the imagination and making sure that people believe the only world possible is the one they know. So it took Roosevelt a long time to break out of the terms of discourse, the spectrum of respectable ideas that the second corporate regime had made possible. Now fast forward to the early 70s and the beginning of the current regime, when a combination, a fairly dangerous combination as it turns out, of Southern fundamentalist, revivalist, religious activists catalyzed a new movement in the South for regime change through very sophisticated means, in conjunction with a very well-financed, very well-organized corporate renaissance to retake power and undo the protections for workers and communities that had been achieved under the New Deal regime. And that combination of the religious right based in the South, which was a grassroots activist movement, very much like the civil rights movement, and one that I think we can learn a lot from. In fact, I'm glad we're speaking in a church, because regime change is a spiritual as well as material process for reasons that I think you might understand, but I'll talk more about that shortly. But we can learn a lot about that process, which led to a very basic change in the way America is ruled today. I call the current regime, that's that structure sitting right under Bush and Kerry's feet, on which they place their weight, and which guides the direction they both move, the third corporate regime. It crystallized with the election of President Reagan, and it became the third period in which, through the processes of globalization and increasingly a more militarized foreign policy, first directed against the Soviet Union and then directed against Islamic fundamentalism, became the basis for instituting a truly unprecedented form of financial power and control, not only in the United States and the world. So let me just quickly tick off the three elements of the current regime that we have the misfortune to live under. I've lived most of my adult life under this regime. I always envied my father, who was a New Deal economist, a labor economist, because he lived under a president that he could believe in. How many of us live today under a president or a regime that we can feel good about? I've always felt my father was lucky because he had that experience, and I've really never had it. And in fact, things have gotten so difficult in this country that I've noticed in going around the country that many people are talking about leaving the country. And I know that sounds frivolous and sort of the indulgence of privileged people who have enough money to pick up and go to New Zealand or some nice island. Of course, I always tell people who talk this way, as I mentioned from my tour in Europe, you can't really leave America because America is everywhere and it's imposing this regime's set of rules all over the world. But if you're thinking of leaving, I recommend a book by Randall Robinson called Quitting America, and a very influential African-American leader who did quit. He left, and he's very happy. And I'm a little alarmed to see how many people like ourselves are actually seem to be entertaining this idea. Now, of course, when you go abroad, people say, don't you dare leave. Your responsibility is to get some regime change in Washington, and so that's part of what I'm about here. And by the way, I think Washington plays a very important role in this upcoming presidential election. I'm going to conclude with some discussions about the election. Anyway, the three distinctive features of this regime. One, the two prior corporate regimes were all about securing corporate control of the United States itself. This regime is global. It makes the Roman Empire and the British Empire look shy, because its aspirations are so ambitious. It has the aspiration and the capacity, for the first time, to impose a single set of corporate rules on the planet as a whole. And God save the planet, because it doesn't have much of a future if this regime is able to institutionalize its own constitution around the world. The second aspect of what is different about this regime is how intrusive it is in all phases of our lives. Can anybody yell out to me a sector of the economy or of our lives that is not vulnerable to corporate penetration and ownership today? Think of healthcare. Think of education. Think of water. Water. 90% of our bodies are water. We depend all over the world. People have always viewed water as part of the Earth's commons, our shared heritage. Water is being privatized at a ferocious rate, as you know. There's nothing that the modern corporation doesn't view as a potential source of profit. Is there? Can anybody yell out? I'm sorry? You know, people have raised this before, and I refer them to an article, particularly in the South, about the growth of these large corporate telemarketing, televangelizing churches, which have exactly the structure of the modern corporation. Now, I teach in a Catholic university, and I've written recently about the parallels between the Enron scandal and the Roman Catholic Church. The church is a corporate body. It has a hierarchical, anti-democratic, autocratic, unaccountable structure, and a culture which has led to severe abuse of its parishioners. Not this church. Thank God. Thank God for the Uyas. I was sitting quietly out waiting for the talk, and I read the UUA principles out there. And I thought, boy, now there's the religious revival that we need in this country, sitting right on that wall. In any case, the audacity of modern corporate leaders to penetrate our consciousness. And, you know, I thought of this again in the morning. I always read when I'm traveling around the country. I don't know if you saw this in the Seattle Times today. Now, this is not a particularly radical newspaper, as I understand it. Do you see it? It says, "What country is fighting for the basic right to an independent press?" This was in this morning's Seattle Times, right? And it goes on to talk about America at risk, how around the world corporations are being, well, let me just read you very quickly. Courageous people are standing up to the threat of jail or worse to establish independent media outlets that give people voice in their nation. We have several independent media, thank God, who are right here tonight. Our news and information is increasingly being governed by a handful of huge conglomerates. The majority of commissioners on the Federal Communications Commission has been acting more in the interests of big business than American citizens, and many of our readers, it says, take action, have already offered to join us in our fight to save the Seattle Times, one of the last independent metropolitan newspapers in the country, from takeover by the New York-based Hearst Corporation. Well, I can't speak to the Seattle Times, but takeover by the Hearst Corporation is going to make things worse. And I emphasize, you're not sure. Well, I'm not totally surprised, but you know, this business of corporatization of the mass media is serious business. Because, again, remember that regimes are about control of the mind. And people's minds, people's views of the world, particularly of the political world, their social world, is heavily shaped by the media. And so I was, you know, it's a very serious proposition that a larger and larger of, you know, around the world, 5 or 6 multinational conglomerate corporate media are controlling the news and information that people are receiving. And I'll come back to that when we talk about some of the possibilities of hope. But let me just tell you, I spent about a week with Jonathan Steele, an old friend of mine who writes for The Guardian, the famous British magazine, who's been in Baghdad for the last 6 months or so. And he and I went up to my little cottage up in the lake, in a New Hampshire lake, and talked about Iraq for about a week. And I'll tell you, I came back from that, and this guy has been doing nothing but traveling with a driver and a translator around Iraq, been seeing things that I had, and I'm a media addict, that I had never seen reported on the New York Times or the American press. So this control by corporations of our media is just, it's very, very central to the ability of the regime to maintain its own legitimacy. And third, I just want to say basically that the regime has become dangerous in the most obvious sense. That has, I think, triggered so much of the animosity about Bush, but is really part of the regime more generally. You know, I worry that by the focus on Bush, and this may trouble, what I have to say here may trouble certain people who are anybody but Bush people. But the way I see it is that the regime, what Bill Clinton did was essentially glue the Democratic Party to this corporate regime. He did it in a much more cosmetic way. And by saying this, I'm not in the least trying to suggest, and this may seem paradoxical to you, that it makes no difference whether the Democrat or the Republican is elected. I think it's exceedingly important that we get Bush out of office. But the Democratic Party, what Clinton did was put a kind of velvet glove over the fist of the regime, and what Bush has done is pull the velvet glove off and reveal the iron fist underneath. And people around the world are feeling that iron fist. Some of it takes the form of the military, imperial, unilateral kind of interventionism that we've seen recently, and some of it takes the form of the IMF and WTO kinds of rules that broke Argentina apart and are destroying the lives of poor people in many, many countries on all continents. Now, having said all this, the fact that this is an increasingly violent regime, let me say that the violence of the regime, the war on terrorism, which has become the newest religion of the regime, is not a sign of its strength. It's a sign of its weakness. When a regime turns to guns as its vehicle for managing control of its domain, it's a sign that the regime is beginning to come apart. Coercion, armed coercion, and many of you, this is something that we might talk about, may not agree with this, but coercion is not a weapon of the strong, it's a weapon of the weak, whether it takes the form of terrorism by stateless actors or of state terrorism by powerful states. I believe, and now I'm starting to turn to the positive message of hope here, that we're moving into a period, which is an unusual period in history, of regime change. Most periods in history, regimes are stable. We've only had, since the Civil War, 5 regimes. Those periods of regime change, which are periods of deep systemic change in the underlying, what's underneath those personalities, where their feet are anchored, they're not revolutions. They don't change capitalism in America. They're not like the change from apartheid in South Africa or the breakdown of the Soviet Union. But they are very significant changes, for example, from the 20s to the New Deal, and from the New Deal to the Reagan Revolution. I believe that this regime is decomposing. And it's trying desperately to save itself with guns, both abroad and at home. Why is it decomposing? Well, the regime, and I don't have time to, because I'm already close to the end of my time here, but the regime, all regimes get old. There's never been a regime in the United States which has lasted more than about a generation. A regime arises out of the actions of certain groups to manage the country. And then, despite their best efforts, or in some cases their very poor efforts, which is true of the corporate elites today, who have pretty much abandoned the effort to maintain their own system. They're taking their money and running fast. So, you know, Ken Lay can take $330 million out of Enron in 3 years, knowing that the corporation is going down. And I think so did the head of Tyco, took about the same amount of money, so did the head of WorldCom. That's a metaphor for a capitalist system which is allowing its own ship to crash into the Titanic. And the signs of this regime unraveling are too obvious almost to enumerate. The government is going bankrupt. We are trillions of dollars in debt, and I'm not a deficit hawk, and I'm not part of the normal screaming about deficits, but there is no question today that the government is going into essentially unsustainable fiscal crisis. There's also, as you well know, about the themes that Jess was singing about, a crisis for the American worker and for the global worker. Half the country fears that they might lose their job in the next year. And most Americans cannot afford to lose a job. Most Americans are a few weeks away from bankruptcy if they lose a paycheck. The country, and this is not, this flows out of the nature of a corporate regime to redistribute resources and wealth from the poor and middle classes to the rich. But it's happening now in an accelerated way, and not just through outsourcing and the fact that Lou Dobbs, a conservative CNN analyst, gets exercised about global outsourcing of jobs, which is a very significant sign of regime change in itself, when conservatives like Dobbs peel off of the global economic consensus and say there's something fundamentally wrong with the way America is running the world today. But in any case, we are in a period where my judgment is regime change is on the horizon. It's happened before. Every corporate regime in American history has succumbed to regime change. And I believe it's going to happen again, independent of the results of what happens in the current elections. However, let me say something about this. Well, let me move quickly to the question of how I think regime change can happen in the country, and because it's sort of the question that Vicki said we were going to talk about, might be able to do and think about. And I want to talk about two things. First, about what people could do in their communities to sort of move this inevitable regime change process in a positive rather than a scarily negative direction. And then talk about the elections briefly in the frame of this, how I see the elections in this. And let me just talk about the issue of what you can do in a very local sense. Let me just use the example that I suspect many of you are familiar with. When Walmart went into the town of Inglewood, which is a suburb of Los Angeles, they were turned down by some enlightened city council people in Inglewood. They came back funding a little committee called the Citizens of Inglewood Welcome Walmart to its community, gave it a few $1 million, and set up a ballot initiative which said that about 4 football fields worth of space in Inglewood would be essentially like a free trade zone on the border of Mexico. It would be a totally corporate ruled space. The city council of Inglewood would have no legal authority over Walmart City. Walmart City would be and this is an example of how a corporate regime which marries big business with big government dispenses with the fiction of government altogether and simply directly takes over rule of a space, right? So in this space that Walmart was proposing in Inglewood, the corporations would rule directly. You would need a little passport to walk into Walmart City, and the rules of Inglewood would not apply. The rules of the US Constitution would be problematic, much as the rules of free trade zones in Mexico or the Philippines or Vietnam pretty much exclude the corporations from control by their own governments. So I use example, and the community then understanding the threat to democratic sovereignty of that community rose up to say no. And they defeated this Walmart initiative with overwhelming power. Now, when I spoke in San Francisco and Berkeley about a month ago, many of you may know this, I was actually getting my car towed while I was coming out of a radio program in Pacifica Radio in Berkeley. A woman runs up to me and says, "Wait a minute, you got to talk to me." I said, "Who are you?" She said, "I'm on the city council of the city of Berkeley, and today we are celebrating because," and she pulled out a piece of paper, and it was a resolution that was passed unanimously that night, which said this. It said, "The city of Berkeley," unanimously in its council, is recommending, is advocating, is embracing the idea that the constitutions of the United States and of California should be amended to say that the corporation is not a person in the city of Berkeley or in the state of California, that it is not protected by constitutional rights, and it cannot claim to usurp the rights of ordinary citizens under the name of the American Constitution. Now that kind of initiative, which was very powerful, passed unanimously, has been ordinances of this kind and more robust ordinances, which don't recommend such changes, but actually specifically say the corporation is not a person in our community, are passing in communities around the country. And in our question and answer, some of you may know about the work of Tom Lindsay and POCLAD and groups that are working on corporate personhood and corporate rights issues. They're very important because what's integrally related, a corporate regime is a system of corporate rights, constitutionally protected. What we need is a new civil rights movement for the people Jess was singing about, for the workers of the world. And as long as the Constitution is being written in the World Trade Organization for the world, and that is a world constitution essentially that's being drafted there. That's why I came to Seattle and was prepared to get gassed here. Because I knew that this was a constitution. This was a constitutional moment. It was a period when a very fundamental change in the planet was taking place. And communities around the country have to reclaim, I know Reclaim Democracy, which is a great organization, is getting its roots here out in Seattle, I think for the first time. There are a lot of organizations and cities around the country that are trying to reclaim democracy at a local level. And that means renouncing corporate rights in their own community. That may take many forms, but there are many ways to do that. And what's important about that, I just want to say I express appreciation to Vicki to introducing me to Reverend Jeffers, is that right? Many of you know him, wonderful man. There are people who are recognizing the need to rebuild community in both the economic sense, the spiritual, and the social sense, and to essentially create a new kind of economy at the local level. And we all desperately need to participate in that effort. And part of the discussion, I think, that should follow this talk is, how is this possible in an age of big corporations? I had to admit to Vicki, just before I came here, because I found it easier than I thought, I went into Whole Foods, because I like natural foods. Whole Foods is a corporation now, of course, a big corporation. I know that it's trying to open another store downtown Seattle, and that's being resisted. How do you feel going into a big corporation like that? These are personal questions, and I just want to say two things in fleshing out this issue of what to do. It's got to be authentic personally. You got to think about, how do you feel going into a Walmart or into a Whole Food that's a corporation? Because we're all deeply embedded in the corporate order. So this regime change is going to require change in the way we live our lives. That's pretty hard to deal with, and it might be part of our conversation here. The other thing I want to say, since I'm speaking in the UU Church, is what the regime changers of the right realized was that regime change is political change is very personal, and it's very spiritual. That's why it belongs in a conversation in a church, concerned with ethics and morality and the principles of community. The religious right drew on the anxieties of people as the Vietnam War and the protests of the 60s and the rise of gas prices and other economic contradictions, including the rise of mass inflation that threatened people's homes and well-being, they spoke. The skill of the regime changers of the new right was to use religion as a vehicle to bring people together and try to heal them, but in the direction of a dangerous political, corporate-defined, era. And I want to say that, and I'll come to this in a minute in talking about Bush. Bush speaks to a religious base, and in a very frightening way, and I want to come to that when I talk to. But we, as a responsibility, and the UUs, I'm so glad that so many of my talks during this travel around the country have been in UU congregations, because I think the UUs are the kind of religious community that can spearhead a spiritually informed kind of passion for social justice, which speaks to the need that each of us has personally to be reintegrated into community. A regime, politics that doesn't speak to personal needs in families that are suffering abuse or alcoholism or, child abuse. This has to be a personally oriented politics, and churches play a very important role in that. So I think thinking about how the Unitarian Church, I don't know, how many of you here are members of this congregation, just out of curiosity? Okay. I mean, that's a very important conversation to have, and one of the reasons I'm proud of UUJEC's work and so forth, and have tried to be a supporter and been proud to be supported by them, is I think that UUJEC, the social justice arm of the UUs, has been very focused on how to make what I'm talking about real and vivid in your congregations and in your communities and in your lives. Now let me just conclude with some discussion about Mr. Kerry and Mr. Bush. Because again, it might seem paradoxical to you that I say, on the one hand, the Democratic Party is flatly and solidly hammered into the corporate regime underneath the surface. And on the other hand, I'm saying it's unbelievably important to get Bush out of office. Well, why is it important to get Bush out of office if Kerry is just part of the same regime, speaking with a slightly smoother voice, putting the velvet glove back on? I believe that if Bush is reelected, there is still going to be a regime change, or what you might call a regime tip. And that's because, as I said before, and as I flesh out more in the book, the regime is going through a process of decomposition. It's not financially, economically, or politically able to sustain itself. The way that such corporate regimes, in fact many regimes, try to sustain themselves under these conditions is to move toward a kind of military war, a war against evil that can unite the country and distract people from the feeling of terror they have in their own jobs and their own lives, to be focused on foreigners who represent evil and terror abroad. Now, of course, when, I didn't see this on the buses of Seattle, but in San Francisco, it said on the bus, when you are on this bus, you are being recorded and videoed. In Boston, at the back of the bus, there is a face with a big eye. And the eye is looking at you, it says, keep your eye on your neighbor. Now this is kind of Orwellian, right? And I just tell you a little story. I went to jail in solidarity with the Janitor for Justice movement, which many of you know about. I had been in jail many times before because I was an anti-Vietnam War activist and an activist around Central America and so forth. This jail experience was very different. There were sheafs of FBI and CIA dossiers about terrorism on the Boston jail station. There were, I was held indefinitely. I was told I would be held indefinitely until it was demonstrated and cleared through the FBI and CIA that I was not working for Osama bin Laden. In fact, one of our indie media person was just trying to wire me up for this talk, and I got slightly nervous because I thought if I was wired up, that might be a sign that I was actually a terrorist or something. I mean, this is all intended. All we had done was sit down in front of a financial building in Boston in solidarity with these janitors. Now, and I want to say that some of my students who witnessed this protest on my part One of them later, you may have heard about, went up on a little soapbox, a little table in front of a military recruitment station in Boston, put on a cape, a hood over his vest, and got wired up with wires on his arms. You may have heard about this from Amy Goodman on Democracy Now! And so forth. He was, of course, making a statement about the Iraq prisoners and the abuse of Iraq prisoners, because he looked just like one of those prisoners that you saw on TV. And he was arrested as a terrorist, an enemy combatant of the state, and held indefinitely. He's been released now because of the outrage that came from this. But it's a sign of how a Bush second term could become a proto-fascist kind of regime. Corporate regimes have not been fascist in America. I don't like to talk about fascism. I don't like to use the word loosely. But when large numbers of young men or middle-class men, as in Germany, are economically disenfranchised, are nervous about assertions by women and by racial groups and so forth, and you have opportunistic leaders who are trying to save their skins, as Hitler demonstrated brilliantly in the 20s and 30s in Germany, you can see a regime tip of a corporate regime toward some American form of fascism. I don't want to go there. And I think we could go there. When I think about what would happen to the Supreme Court, to the nature of the people in the Bush administration, the problems of this regime, I tell you very seriously that a second Bush term could move us toward the first genuinely proto-fascist. It won't be a German fascism or Italian fascism, and it might not be a fascism that the global companies are perfectly content with. It's a myth, a traditional old left myth, that the big corporations in Germany were eager to sign on to Hitler. But they did make their peace with it. And the big corporations today might make their peace with the kind of regime change politics that Mr. Bush might introduce. Because I don't want to go there, because I was in jail recently, because I know what this would mean, I take very seriously the idea of the potential catastrophe of a second Bush term. Now, Kerry, what does that tell us about what would happen if Kerry is elected? I'm going to end here because I'm running a little bit late. But for many reasons, I believe that Kerry, while he's not a regime changer, in fact, he will put the velvet glove back on the regime, quiet down the European concerns, maybe make the Americans look a little better. He's going to be faced with the same fundamental problems. And our job is to push Mr. Kerry toward the kinds of politics. When we wake up, if we're lucky enough to get a Kerry victory on November 2nd or 3rd, we're going to feel euphoric, and it's going to last about 24 hours, maybe 48, maybe 72. And then we're going to wake up, 3 days later with a crushing headache, saying, oh my God, look what we're facing. And what we have to have in place, and we should be pushing it now, making Kerry commit himself to these issues now, because he needs to win. He needs to mobilize his base and to mobilize those 100 million Americans who don't participate in politics because they don't think it makes a dime's bit of difference whether the Republicans or the Democrats are elected. It's interesting that out of Boston, Kerry made one regime change proposition. He said all Americans are entitled to health care. That, in the current corporate regime, which is trying to strip away all social rights from Americans, was a regime change proposition. Kerry got no bounce out of the Democratic Convention, but he got a 30% bounce on health care out of that statement. Kerry cannot just win as the anti-Bush. He has to win as a person who will stand up for certain principles, but that will only happen as Roosevelt. Think back to how Roosevelt changed. Roosevelt was pushed by churches, new labor unions, new housing organizations for all the people who are being thrown out of their homes. It's up to you and me to help move the Democratic Party away from this regime, which is a very big proposition. I know there are people sitting here who will say, dream on. The Democratic Party will never unmoor itself from this dying regime. And I agree with that sufficiently to say that my good friend Ralph Nader and other third parties have a place in American politics, but not the place, in my judgment, that Ralph is running today. We need green parties and independent parties at the local level, at the state level, but we need ways to make sure that we get these neoconservative ideologues who represent the far extreme form of a very extreme regime out of power. And so I want to say, just in conclusion, Washington is a swing state now. It hasn't voted, you know, it's within when I turned on the news this morning, it said it was within the statistical margin of error between Kerry and Bush. For all you people who share my view that the Democratic Party has lost its soul, that's not a mandate to give up on this election and turn it over to Bush, for the reasons that I mentioned and reasons that I haven't yet, but which you might discuss. And I would say, you know, if you're uncomfortable voting for Kerry, vote swap with somebody in Massachusetts or something like me who will vote for Nader because it's safe to do so, allowing you to vote, hold your nose, as my friend Noam Chomsky likes to say, hold your nose and vote for Kerry in the current elections. Okay, let me just reframe the question that Vicki raised in my own sense, and I think we're going to break up for a little conversation. My view is that, and I've said this before, but I want to reiterate it, words, words, words. I'm a wordsmith, I teach, but you know, politics moves from the spirit and from the gut and from the pocketbook. It's got to be visceral. So all this talk I've been doing, you know, about corporate personhood, constitutional rights, you know, how does that stuff bounce off the viscera of yourself and average people? You know, it sounds pretty academic. It sounds abstract. Of course, it has profound impacts on the daily life and the daily thinking, as the Seattle Times point out. Not your most radical medium to express this. But my question I'd like to see discussed here, and I like this participative mode that Vicki has suggested, is how do we take these ideas and make them, you know, viscerally meaningful in the lives and thinking of ordinary people in Seattle, in Washington, you know, in not just on the western coast of Washington, but on the east side of the mountains in Washington, that different state you have over there. How do you make these ideas real to people who are vulnerable to these proto-fascist appeals from Mr. Bush and could start talking about guns the way the brown-shirted troops in Germany did in 1933 when people were going through great pain and economic crisis. So that's my question for you. How can we take these rather grand, broad ideas and turn them into personally, the women's movement did this successfully. It showed that politics was in the bedroom. It was in relationships. This is about community. It's about the ways in which corporate rights and power are undermining the way we relate to each other, to our community, to our very humanity, to our spirituality. So I'd like some conversation and like to learn from you about how you think these issues can become part of your life in a very personal way and how we can bring that understanding to the lives of people all over the country and the world. Thanks a lot.